She went walking out across. I'm like, sweetheart, it's actually, you don't want to stand in front. It's fine. Right down she went. Who was that? But we'll see.
For the record,
She just wrote across it later. Split into it. She was extremely lucky. As soon as she did it, I went, well, that's what's today's project. We'll see. Those boards out. While you're down there looking at instructions. So here's the thing.
Some strange pigment. We don't want you here anymore.
Okay, folks, if I can, if you haven't signed in yet on the computer, you need to do that. We need to have a record of you being here. So if you haven't signed in, staff as well. If you haven't signed in yet, please do so.
Staff doesn't need to.
What's that?
Staff does not need to.
Staff doesn't need to? All right. We have Alex Lee with us here tonight with IPIB. He's going to do the presentation. I'm assuming if there's questions, you'll take those at any time. Is that correct?
Anytime.
Okay. We do have two chairs up here. You're going to have to be able to see the screen. So if you are not in a position where you can see the screen one way or the other, I might suggest that you find someplace that will work for you.
If I were to present from over here, would everybody be able to hear me?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
We're good. Have at it.
So, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to try to keep it to around 90 minutes. As the gentleman mentioned, we take questions throughout, so I think that's just the easiest way to do things. That way, if I misspeak, or if there's something that isn't clear from our presentation, we're able to answer it as it comes up rather than having a Q&A at the end. Just feel free to call out, raise your hand. I'll keep an eye on the room. That's why I'm presenting from here rather than from over there. With that, thank you for being here. I, again, am aware that it is Iowa Sunshine Laws. We're going to be covering Chapter 21 and Chapter 22. Before we get to that, the disclaimer that we present at the beginning of all of these presentations is that this presentation is not intended to be legal advice. We're giving information for those of you who are here for training. This is enough to cover that new requirement that was passed by the legislature, but that doesn't mean that this presentation, PowerPoint, can be relied on alone for making actual legal decisions. If you have a situation that comes up where you don't know if you can go into a closed session, or whether a record qualifies as a public record, whether it qualifies as confidential, what you'd want to do is you'd want to consult with city, county attorney, whoever it is for your government body, as opposed to relying on the slide file. Just a little bit about IPIB before the main portion of the presentation. We are probably the smallest agency in the state. At the moment, we have 2 total people. That's not 2 under the director. That's not 2 with support staff. That is 2 attorneys, the director, and myself. Which, unless there's somewhere out there with a one-person agency, I think that does qualify us. With that in mind, we are also one of the few agencies in the nation that has the authority to enforce. And that means hear complaints, issue rulings on state sunshine laws. We cover both open records and open meetings. We also offer advice. We offer interpretations of the law. We have advisory opinions on our website. We are available as a resource for the public to reach out to, for members of governmental bodies to reach out to. And our job, ideally, in doing that is to prevent the complaints and the violations from happening in the first place. And we've only been around since 2013, so here's hoping. Only been a little over a decade. We have 8 members at the moment. It's a 9-member board in total with 1 vacancy. They're appointed by the governor. And if you ever are looking for something fun to do on a Thursday afternoon, we have our board meetings on the 3rd Thursday of the month. They last a couple hours, sometimes more. And they're available live stream on our YouTube channel. So again, great entertainment, I've heard. There's my face. And then open meetings. So right from the get-go, the purpose of Chapter 21 is to provide transparency so that the public knows how the government is making its decisions. Not just the decisions themselves, the voting, the new ordinance announced in the paper, but the decision-making process, the opinions of the governmental body that go into those official acts, whatever they may be, whatever type of governmental body it is. I'm aware that we have folks who, city council, I don't know, we looking at county boards, library boards.
Yeah, they're all city boards and
City
commissions, yeah.
boards. All right. Anyway, 21 opens up with this phrase, ambiguity in the construction or application of this chapter should be resolved in favor of openness. Whenever there is a gray area, whenever we, or the courts are faced with, here's a gray area in the text of the law because things are not always perfectly drafted, we know that the interest is transparency because the purpose of the law is to make sure that the people know what their government is doing and how they're making the decisions that they make. Here's a little roadmap for how we're going to be approaching each topic within Chapter 21. We're going to start with whether you are a governmental body, what qualifies as a governmental body. We're going to talk about what constitutes a meeting, the 4 elements of a meeting under Chapter 21. We're going to talk about the legal requirements for a meeting, and then we're going to talk about closed sessions. The governmental bodies. Governmental bodies include the obvious. It includes the boards, commissions, those governing bodies established by state statute. So IPIB and any other, the Iowa Utilities Commission, Ethics Board. It also includes all of these local governments. So city councils. It includes boards of supervisors, library boards of directors, boards of education, township trustees, fire districts, drainage districts. It goes all the way down. Any of those governing bodies, the voting boards that represent districts or head up a tax-supported district or a political subdivision, all of those are considered governmental bodies. However, if you are not a member of the governmental body in the sense that you vote and participate as part of the decision-making board itself, you are not a member of the governmental body, even though you may be a member of the government. So clerks, in general, would not be members of a governmental body. Within this definition as well, we have advisory boards and commissions involved with 2080 power sharing agreements. So whenever there are joint exercises of power between different governmental bodies and it's formalized under 2080, those boards qualify. Same goes for power sharing agreements with private entities. Those boards, which are formed to exercise whatever their government function is, those are governmental bodies. You'll also see in the middle something weird. Nonprofit corporations only applies to parimutuel, wagering, and gambling boards. The reason for that is because when 99F and 99D were passed into law, the easiest way that the legislature could come up with to make sure that they were transparent in their operations was to decide that they were a governmental body, and so they are. Here's a fun little flow chart. I know folks in the back might not be able to see this. We will make this available. So if I can send it, I think I've already sent this PowerPoint to, I'm looking for Jackie. I don't see Jackie.
Here, I don't think
You're the one person I can't see.
I had it. I don't think I have it.
I will send it to you after this meeting. Anybody who wants it can request it from us, can request it from Jackie. I don't mean to put too much work on your plate,
No, you're fine.
but we want to make sure that it's available because I know that you can't see this up here. Probably make a good board game too. But it should resolve about 95% of the questions. There are some gray areas within the law, but there's not many. Speaking of gray areas though, one of the big questions that's left over by some of the court decisions on what is a governmental body is the difference between advisory boards and policy-making subcommittees. In general, if you have boards that are created by the city council, whether it's zoning boards, boards of adjustment, those are going to be governmental bodies because they have some sort of authority that's been delegated to them. There are a handful that the Supreme Court has recognized are purely advisory functions that may be created by one of those subdivisions. What we say is, if you're in that gray area and you don't know one way or the other, it's better to err on the side of caution, assume you're a governmental body, and comply with Chapter 20. That's best practice, unless you're sure you're not. Whether you're holding a meeting is the next question. And 21.2 subsection 2 provides 4 elements for a meeting. From the top, governmental body. So chapter 21 from the get-go only applies to governmental bodies. It doesn't apply to private corporations. It doesn't apply to groups of mayors. It doesn't apply to the clerk speaking with the city attorney, speaking with a concerned citizen, right? Only governmental bodies, those decision-making voting boards, are covered by chapter 21. And that's why they're the first element. The second element is a majority. So majority, that's two out of 3, 3 out of 5. I probably don't need to spell it out. Majority is pretty simple. Deliberation or action means, and we'll get a little more into it on the next slide, but deliberation or action means that there's opinions being shared. Action means any vote. So that's pretty obvious. Any vote, even if it fails, even if it's a vote to table the matter for the future, that's an action of the government. Deliberation's a little bit more complicated, but not that much more complicated. It's a low threshold, and what we're looking at for that is the sharing of opinions. So whether it's an informal poll, whether it is, can we, here's my opinion, what's your opinion, whether it's I think we should do this, I feel we should do this, that's deliberation. And then the fourth is that whatever that discussion is needs to be on a matter within the scope of the governmental body's policymaking duties. So policymaking duties differentiates it from social gatherings and ministerial gatherings. And so for this reason, it's not a meeting if you're not a member of a governmental body, or if we're not talking about a gathering of members of a governmental body. It's not a meeting if there's not a majority. So if there's a 5-person city council and 2 of them meet, they can talk about whatever. That's not a meeting. If there's no deliberation or action, you're receiving information, but you're not deliberating amongst one another, that's not a meeting. And if you're talking about where you're going to get dinner after this, that's not a meeting. Chapter 21 only applies to meetings. Anything else is not covered by this chapter.
Is this considered a meeting?
Not because you're just receiving information. And that is where deliberation comes in. I'll get to that in a second. Best practice, though. It doesn't matter what you call a meeting. It doesn't matter if you call it a work session. It doesn't matter if you say, this is just a weekend retreat, or we're just gathering informally, or we're discussing something over email or text. If you've met all 4 of those elements, no matter what you call it, it is a with that in mind, deliberation, informational sessions are the exception. One of 3 exceptions that are used. Informational session means you're receiving information, but you're not discussing anything amongst yourselves. Informational does include your ability to ask questions. There's a case called Hitinga that we kind of refer to because I think it's a good example of what we're looking at. It involved a city council. They went out to view a piece of property that they were considering purchasing using government funds. And during that trip, they met with the person who, I don't remember whether it was an attorney or the representative of that, transaction, but they met and they said, when do you think we can close on this? They asked for details about a few things, but they weren't deliberating whether they were going to make that purchase. They were receiving information. And what the court said is they walked a fine line. They came right up to the line because it's really easy to slip into deliberation. That's why this is the risky loophole. But it wasn't actually deliberation. They were just asking questions. Now, that just asking questions thing, we always say best practice, don't rely on that if you're going to be meeting outside of an official meeting. Because it's really easy to use phrases like, I think we should, I feel this could, I would or wouldn't support this. My opinion on this matter is this. Let's take an informal poll to find out what everybody's thinking. Any of those statements probably precede something that's going to start a deliberation, whether you mean to or not. To avoid deliberation outside of open session, you can do one of 2 things. 1, make sure you're only receiving information, or 2, better yet, have it in a meeting, even if it's not going to become a meeting. Oftentimes, there's reports in every meeting that I ever attend. There's, here's the mayor's report, here's staff report, whatever it may be. They give you that information, strictly speaking, not a meeting. But this allows you to say, oh, what do I think of that? How do I feel about this? What can we do about this? Can we plan for this next time without slipping into that meeting? And again, deliberation is a low threshold. Social gatherings. So this is the next exception to meetings. Social gatherings, members can meet socially, and probably this is the most obvious example. Anytime IPIB meets, we have 8 members, they come into the room, they're from all across the state, and they'll sit down in the room together and they'll say, the weather on the drive here was awful or is great. Or, hey, do you know where in town is good? And somebody will say, there's this restaurant that I really like in Des Moines that's great. And then somebody will say, well, I heard it's actually not that great or it's overpriced. That's kind of deliberation, but that's social. It's not related to the policy-making duties of the governmental body. Again, the purpose of the law is to allow citizens to see how their officials arrive at a decision, hear the discussion. The purpose of the law is not for them to hear what your favorite restaurant in Des Moines is. And then even retreats or public meetings if a quorum is present. The other thing that we advise, I don't know if we have a slide for this on this version of the PowerPoint, but we say, look, if you're going to meet socially, we get that, especially Indianola is not quite there, but when we speak with really small towns where it's a few blocks, everybody's in the same groups, they meet up, there's a country club, you're members of the same Rotary Club, or you go to church and you see each other, next pew over, whatever it may be. It's pretty easy to say, hey, how are you doing? And it's also easy to slip into, hey, what do you think about that, that park maintenance that we were talking about last meeting? I know what the others said, but I'm not comfortable with the idea of spending that much money. That's casual conversation, and it might create a meeting. So we just urge the utmost caution. It's easy to create a meeting, and I'm not going to harp on that any longer. It's just easy to create a meeting. Ministerial events are the more complicated of those 2 exceptions to policy-making duties. Policy-making duties is the official discretionary authority of the government. Ministerial is governmental business, but it's on the outside of that. So policy-making includes things like passing an ordinance, amending your budget, deciding whether you're going to hire or fire an employee. Those are all official discretionary things. Ministerial includes the outer perimeter of the government's business. So things like, let's say you needed to hold a special session and you wanted to see when everybody was available. You could say, I'm available at 3 p.m. Could we do it on Monday? Somebody else could deliberate and say, well, no, actually that doesn't work for me. We can do this time instead. That's deliberation, but we consider that ministerial. Ministerial also includes arranging a venue. Let's say City Hall shuts down for maintenance. We're going to pick an alternative venue. It's this one or this one. What are the pros and cons of that? Ministerial, we've also found that this includes, you're attending a civic event and you're speaking on behalf of the city, you're representing them, you're saying, I don't know local traditions, but I was just in Pella, they have their lovely, spring heritage, they have their parade. The whole city council comes together and they're on a float, they're wearing Dutch costumes. It's wonderful. And if they're having a conversation about, who gets to hold the flag or whatever, who gets to sit in the front, it's kind of related to city business, but it's really ministerial because you're not exercising that core authority that's been delegated to you by the state or by law.
Alex, on a question on that, so a lot of times we'll send out an electronic poll to find out, is somebody available on this time to set up meetings? I'm assuming that falls into that category, is that correct?
Yeah, if you're not discussing business aside from that, you can absolutely send out a poll like that. Totally fine. Best practice. We tell people it's best to be transparent if you know that you're going to be at an event together. This isn't required by Chapter 21, but if you're going to be at a civic event together, or if you know that members are going to get together for a holiday party, celebrate over whatever it is, we say, maybe best practice is to still notify people because if they see you together in public, that might raise suspicions. Just best practice. But providing that sort of notice that this is going to happen is that extra step in transparency. Another best practice is oftentimes it's easier to avoid sitting together, especially with the majority. 5 people, it's easy to avoid being in that 3-person gathering. You know, this happens from time to time. We get that you might be friends, right? But best practice, if you are together, make sure the conversation topics are social, avoid bringing up government business. For email and text, I said this.
Sorry, on
Yes.
that last one, can you provide any example where that happens, Bob and Sally are going to some civic event, and
Sure.
how would you notify?
Sure, so just an example would be, this one came up a month or two ago. School board, they were getting together, they said, it was before the election, they were trying to encourage people to run to fill a vacancy. They provided a notice, they didn't have to do this, but they provided a notice at one of their meetings to say, hey, we're going to hold this meeting in the future. We're not going to be discussing any business. We're just going to be talking to people about what we do as a governmental body, hopefully get people interested, and we're going to have a few of these events. So again, that's just best practice. There's no rules for how to do that. It's just a matter of, it's good for people to know.
Good example, thank you.
Alex, I'm gonna throw one other one out at you. So whenever there's a study being done or some studies, I know DOT does this frequently, but we've had, there's some situations in which you might have an architect working on a master plan for a particular area or a park area or whatever the case is, and you're inviting the community in those particular cases. I would assume best practice is you go ahead and just put up an agenda that there may be, all the council members may be there, but is that a requirement? I mean, it's gonna be mainly talking about that particular master plan or what the architect's vision of a certain area is, but I'm assuming that kind of falls in that category.
So is this like a public service, like you're giving information about a decision?
It's a
that's been
public
made?
meeting for the public to see what is being proposed.
And this would be at a different location than the
At
normal?
a school, elementary school, for instance, let's say.
We would say, you would be, best practice would probably be to provide that notice, and then you'd be able to have a conversation about it. Now, if you're just giving information to the public and saying, if I can give a similar example from something that actually happened recently for us, we had a city that, they were developing a town square infrastructure plan. They were going to, put up a bunch of, put out benches, change the park, add some greenery. There's a city development plan, and they chose one winning bid from a few others. They went out to that location and had an announcement and said, well, here's what we're working on. Here's the benefits of the bid. They were essentially justifying themselves in the city's choice to spend this money on things. So it's very much that public relations thing. I believe that they did I believe that they did post notice, so they posted it at City Hall and they said there's going to be this event in town. We're not going to be taking action on anything, but we are going to be there, we're going to be discussing things, and that just gives them that extra leeway.
Yeah.
I'd say that's best practice, and if they didn't do that, best practice would have been to do that.
Would that also be for like groundbreakings or ribbon cuttings?
That's ministerial.
Okay.
That's the, official civic duties, but you're not making decisions.
Okay.
And if you are making decisions, make it in a meeting. So,
Okay.
ribbon cutting, that's just the ceremonial duties of the government. Yeah, that was a great question. For email and text, any form of electronic meeting, this is explicitly in chapter 21 in that definition I shared. Electronic, formal or informal, doesn't matter. We had a question last week, which I thought was really interesting, kind of silly, but they said, there's news in all of the members of our city council. They always like to go on social media and share their opinions, and sometimes they'll get into arguments with each other in the comments. That's a meeting if there's a majority. And we got this question by a very frustrated city attorney, but the reason it is a meeting is because even though they're not all there at the same time, this is creating a conversation between them. And this is especially true with email. It's putting the decision-making process outside of the public view anytime you have those conversations. With that in mind, something that a lot of government bodies do, and this is completely permissible, is they will share information one way to their board. So something like a board packet that comes with the agenda to say, here's, we have it on our agenda that we're going to be discussing the budget, but here's the 28 pages of the budget. sent to your email, made available for you. For our board, we hold, our staff attorneys, I say that as if there's all that many of us, but we have the interactions with the cases. We bring the facts to our board along with a recommendation, all of the legal analysis. They make the final decision, but we send that information to them beforehand so that they can deliberate with that information. And that is completely okay. We recommend using the BCC function. That's blind carbon copy. It's the third option on your email. Put all the board members, the voting members' names in the BCC. And that means that when they receive that, if they have a comment, if they want to say, did you get this information right on the budget? Or, hey, can you clarify this for me? I didn't know that we were even considering this. What is this? That is something that could create a meeting. So if they hit reply all in a BCC, they won't contact any of the other people in the governmental body. It's just a safety measure, sort of, because people do hit reply all sometimes. Next, are you complying with all the legal requirements for a meeting? So meetings require a few things. One of those is notice. Notice needs to be posted at least 24 hours in advance of a meeting unless there's an emergency purpose. We'll get to that in a moment. But notice means a physical posting with the date, the time, the location, and a tentative agenda. And that physical posting, you can kind of tell from the way that it's worded that Chapter 21 was written several decades ago and has not, at least this part, been updated. I think a lot of governmental bodies, the way that they actually get the word out about their upcoming meetings is to post it online. I think that's practical. Strictly speaking, Chapter 21 does not require that. We encourage it, but it's not required. Instead, what's required is a physical posting in a prominent place at the governmental body's office, that's City Hall. I think at least for the City Council, I can't speak for necessarily every board and commission, but if you have a main primary office, that's where the posting should be made. If there is no office, then it should be at the location where the meeting is held. If those are two different places and both exist, we recommend doing both, but strictly speaking, the governmental body's office is where it should be posted. The other is notice of the meeting must be sent to any news organization requesting it. For our purposes, whenever we get a request to send notice in advance, we just honor it. We don't look into whether they qualify as a news organization. It's the easiest thing in the world. You just create a list. We have around 200 people. We send it all out at once to everybody, and that fully covers our obligations for news media alerts. City councils and a few other types of governmental bodies have additional publication requirements in their area of the chapter. So Chapter 21 doesn't have publication requirements aside from these two. City councils, boards of supervisors, anybody covered by 28H, there's a few others, but each of those have publication requirements that require you to put notice in a newspaper. We don't have jurisdiction over that, but it is something that we want to make folks aware of as well. I imagine you're all aware of it, but it's there. Posting on the inside of a glass door to a governmental building, usually best way to do it. That's what we do at our administrative office. That just ensures that if the public is walking by after hours, they have access to it. When we say prominent place accessible to the public, this can mean a variety of things. What it shouldn't be is, this is on the second floor, employees only area, the staff lounge, this is something like that. Pretty obvious. I probably don't need to over-explain that. Agendas. So I mentioned 4 requirements for notice. The big one is the tentative agenda. An agenda needs to include all of the topics that the governmental body is going to be discussing at the meeting. Emergencies are the exception, but emergencies are a very rare exception. Emergencies include, a tornado, God forbid, comes through the town. There's a concern that some people aren't going to have a warm place to stay for the night. If the city wanted to meet on less than 24 hours notice to coordinate those emergency relief efforts, they would be able to do that. Emergencies could also include, just as a more mundane example, and this is from a real case, a school board receives notice that the heater in the middle school has shut down. It's broken overnight. They need somebody to come out and do a $4,000 repair. as soon as possible, otherwise kids aren't going to be able to go to school for the rest of the week. That qualifies as an emergency too. So significant financial loss, significant property loss, danger to human health or life. It shouldn't be, oh, we forgot to put the budget on the agenda. You know, we gotta get that done. Well, if you could have done, if it's not impossible or impractical, to postpone it to another meeting, 24 hours in advance, what we say is most governmental bodies, most people serving in a governmental body should probably never see an emergency session. It happens. IPIP has never had one. There's not a lot of public records emergencies, but fingers crossed. I don't know what it would look like. For the rest of agendas, agendas need to have enough information that somebody viewing the agenda item would know what was being discussed. That doesn't mean a long, 2-paragraph explanation of everything that's in the city ordinance that's being considered. But it also doesn't mean approval of old minutes, old business, new business. And it doesn't mean single word descriptors like parks, right? So parks is insufficient. I think it would be too much to say, well, we might be approving a $6,000 renovation to repair, there's a tree that fell down at Hodgkins Park. We're doing it for this reason, here's how long it's gonna take. That's too much. Hodgkins Park renovation action possible, or discussion possible action would be perfectly sufficient. There's a lot of ways to meet that requirement. It just needs to be enough that somebody could be apprised of what's being discussed. And anything that isn't on the agenda should not be deliberated on during the meeting. So there's two ways that this manifests. One would be public comment. Public can talk about anything they want. They can say, hey, a tree fell over at the park. I don't know if you're aware of this. We should probably do something about this. It would be inappropriate for the board to then say, oh, let's plan to do this. How much money is this going to cost, and start deliberating on it. That would be inappropriate. The other thing that is allowed in terms of information is if you have something like a mayor's report, you can talk about whatever he wants, as long as we're not using that to get into deliberation on the subjects that aren't otherwise noticed on the agenda, but you can receive that information as a report from anybody listed as a report.
How much discussion, back to the previous slide, how much discussion can you have with public in public comment?
Should be minimal. There shouldn't be back and forth between the government body and the public. Generally speaking. So if the public asks a question and this is something that can just be answered, or if there's, we're concerned about this, yes, we'll look into it, or yes, we can look at it at a future meeting, or yes, we're already looking into this, it's probably fine. Again, what you want to avoid is saying, oh, I wasn't aware of that. Let's get working on that. What do you think, guys, right? That's where it's deliberation. Hopefully that makes sense. I can answer more if there's. For minutes are the flip side of that agenda requirement. Minutes come after the meeting. And it's a public record of the governmental body's decision-making process. It includes much of the same things from the agenda, the date, the time, the place of the meeting. It includes the members present. It includes the votes taken at the meeting. And that includes, within votes, enough information that a member of the public viewing those minutes, seeing who's present, would be able to tell how each person present voted. So if that's unanimous, if it's a 5-0 vote from all the people present, it's fine to say 5-0 unanimous. If it's 3-2, then it needs to say, Jones, Smith, Johnson voted yes. Others voted no. It needs to be enough information to differentiate one from the other.
Alex, I'm sorry, I'm going to kind of piggyback. I'm
Yes, sir.
just thinking through a couple things here that Al brought up, but on public comment, so did I hear you correctly to say the best practice is not to make a comment if it could be avoided and then deal with that down in the
Not just
future
share your
agenda?
opinions about comments.
What's that?
It would be more not sharing your opinions about comments. If there was something that could be answered, it's difficult to speak for every possible
Oh,
public
absolutely.
comment.
No, I get it.
if it was something where your response would be an opinion or where it would potentially launch a conversation, that's more difficult. Unless it's on the agenda. If it's public comment on a matter, so there's a county that I'm aware of that has public comment for each and every item on the agenda. Their meetings last 3 hours, but they're very transparent. And what we saw, we went to one of those meetings for a training session and sat through it. And what we saw was, you know, a member of the public would raise their hands and say, you know, I think this about this. And there was back and forth because it was noticed on the agenda. So if it's an item on the agenda, what I just said doesn't apply. I just wanted to get that in there.
No, so back to that point though, we have in council meetings, generally what's been announced, and if this is not correct, then we need to correct it, but it's been announced that if it's something that's not on the agenda, that you can have your public comment. If it's an item on the agenda, we oftentimes allow the people to have comment during that time if it's on the agenda.
That's permissible.
Thank
You can have rules for public comment.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Kind of along this same conversation, thank you, gentlemen. So in a different city where I was on a commission, yeah, the agenda would have.
So I don't mean to like walk towards you
Okay.
intimidating, I'm just grabbing my drink.
No, all good, all good. Yeah, on the agenda was always time for public comment, where the public who was there could comment. Other than that, it really was the procedure, unless an invited guest who was on the agenda, the public was not to comment. I mean, it was very clearly that they would be quiet, and their contributions were only welcome at a certain time in the meeting. Is that, you know,
So right here, I skipped a few slides, but public participation under 21.7, there's actually nothing in the code that says that you need to allow public comment. It does not need to happen. You can have whatever rules you want for public comment, whether it is they can only speak at this time, whether it is they're limited to 5 minutes, whether it is, you know, public comment period is 30 minutes total, or I'm aware of one governmental body. You kind of collect stories when you go and meet folks. There's one governmental body I'm aware of where they hold a work session at 5 p.m. and a official meeting at 6 p.m. They treat both of them as meetings. No actions are taken and there's no public comment during the work session. I don't know why they do this, but they do it, and they're able to make that rule too. So that's perfectly permissible within 21.7. The only thing that you can't do, and this is more of a First Amendment issue than a Chapter 21 issue, what the court has found, Peterson versus City of Newston, is that you can't discriminate based on a person's viewpoint. So you can't say, this person supports the ordinance, you can talk for 10 minutes, this person doesn't support the ordinance, yeah, you can have 2 minutes. That's not treating them equally. But you can say, you can only talk at this part of the meeting, or here's the portion for general public comments, here's the portion for public comments related to this specific matter. Again, as long as you're not discriminating based on.
Is it okay for an individual to ask to be on the agenda to discuss a specific item before a group
Yes.
or a council or a?
Yes. And you'd have the discretion to decide whether or not you wanted that. But if somebody asked for that opportunity to be on the agenda and you felt that their contribution would be valuable, then absolutely.
It has to be an item that's already on the posted agenda though.
Yes, yes.
No, what if, can they request that an item be put on the agenda?
Yes.
But
As
not,
long as,
but not that night though, right? It has to
but
be-
not on the same.
No, in advance.
Yeah, okay.
My clicker stopped working. I may have to go back to my computer. Or feeling.
Dead batteries.
Oh, Jason will get you.
It's there to save the day.
Please. Maybe the battery died.
Well, my computer's fine.
I'm gonna keep talking about notice. I don't need a PowerPoint. So notice, what am I talking about? Minutes. Minutes need to include at least that much information, including how everybody voted. That way, if somebody was viewing the minutes afterwards, they'd be able to say, oh, you know, so-and-so voted this way. It's essentially, again, that record of how the governmental body made its decisions. 21.8, and this is one that I don't really need a slide for, so it's a great opportunity for the computer to have malfunctions. So 21.8, newly enacted. There was a different version for virtual meetings before July of 2024. After July of 2024, the legislature passed a new law, 21.8, that says every governmental body must provide an electronic option for their members, but not for the public. So there needs to be an option, whether it's a telephone number to call in, whether it's a Zoom link, whether it's, pick whatever it may be. There needs to be at least one option for a member of a governmental body to attend if they're not able to attend in person. The other change made with 21.8 is previously, if you were holding an electronic or remote session, you needed to have a justification for it. Something needed to have happened. The new rule is that you're allowed to hold those virtual sessions. The only caveat to that is the public needs to have access to the conversation. So that doesn't mean that you give them the same Zoom link necessarily. You can. What it does mean is if there's a physical meeting location, then they need to be able to hear the conversation. If somebody calls in, they need to be able to hear whoever's calling in. If it is a purely virtual meeting, then they need either a link to that meeting room, or they need a some sort of live stream that they can watch remotely.
This is really weird. Can I close it for a second and reopen it? Is it like this one?
So to that point then, 21.8 just says you have to have electronic opportunities for those on the body to call in. And if you're in virtual, you need to make sure that people have access or can listen in on those particular things as well. Had a discussion with another mayor at another event, and they were talking that they don't record or they don't provide electronic access to the public for their meetings. Is that still legal, or do you have to?
That's still allowed. If you wanted to hold a meeting that was purely in person, even though there needs to be an option for your members to attend if they choose to, it's perfectly permissible to not have a live stream, not have any sort of, I'm aware, I see the cameras, I see all of that. It's not required. And there does not need to be a permanent recording of the meeting either. Just gonna keep going if people are good with that. I know this PowerPoint in and out. So, what would be next? After minutes, so I just did 21.8, I just did 21.7, closed sessions. Closed sessions are the exception to open meetings law. There are a limited number of opportunities for you to go into closed session to discuss certain topics if you meet all of the requirements of closed session. Again, the code is reluctant to allow this in most circumstances because the default needs to be transparency, but there are those opportunities. There are 12 types of closed sessions listed in 21.5, and there are an additional handful that are found elsewhere in the code. Just as an example of elsewhere in the code, under either 384 or 388, there's an exception that allows a city council that runs a city utility to go into a closed session for the purpose of discussing that city utility's proprietary information, if it's necessary to protect the, competitive position. That's pretty narrow, but it isn't in Chapter 21. I bring that up as an illustration of one type of closed meeting that isn't in Chapter 21. With that in mind, the big ones are in Chapter 21. Before we get to those, I'm gesturing at the screen like it's going to be there. So you need to vote in open session with either a 2/3 majority of the total number of members of the body or all of the members present. It must hit one of those two thresholds. A simple majority is not enough, although it is by default enough if you have a 3-person board. Otherwise, 2/3 or all of the people present if it's less than 2/3 at that meeting. Has to be one of those. Again, that vote needs to take place in open session. Any final action also needs to take place in open session, so you can have the whole discussion, but the final action taken by the governmental body needs to be in closed session. Now let's see if I can remember all 12 exceptions. Most of them are not going to be super relevant in the city context, but these include things like applications for a patent. These include things like public hospitals, information related to their competitive positioning. This includes suspension or expulsion of students. This includes law enforcement matters if the discussion of those law enforcement matters would allow people, members of the public to more easily violate the law. So this is a very specific thing, but if we're talking about, when police officers are going to be patrolling at night, theoretically that is covered. Security systems, whether that's digital security or physical infrastructure, those can be covered if it's necessary to protect that information for life and property, the same interest being protected by these security systems. A few that are more applicable to this group are going to be litigation. So you can discuss strategy with your legal counsel in a closed session if it's related to imminent or active litigation. And this includes litigation equivalent matters before a agency like IPIB. You can have that conversation with legal counsel in closed session, but only insofar as it's necessary to avoid compromising your position in litigation. Just because you have litigation related to a matter doesn't mean that you can discuss anything related to that matter in closed session. Another big exception that might apply to you is the first one. So subsection A, this is for the discussion and review of a document which is allowed to be confidential or required to be confidential by state or federal law. So don't overread it. The courts have a number of cases saying that discussion of these records can't go much further than discussing the contents of the records themselves. With that in mind, anything that is confidential under 22 or any other area of the law can be reviewed in closed session to the extent that is necessary to protect the confidential record itself. The big one that we like to discuss with people, because I think it's the most common, and I think it's also the biggest concern right now with recent legal cases, is having a conversation related to interviews, hiring, performance, potential discharge. If you're going to do any of those things, talking about the professional competency of an employee. Now, there have been two really important recent cases on this, but before I get to those, the big, what's actually required by the code, it needs to be professional competency of an employee related to a decision that the governmental body is considering, whether it's hiring, firing, performance, or termination. It needs to be necessary to prevent needless and irreparable injury to the person's reputation. And it needs to be at the request of that individual. So the reason why we need to bring that up is because there are two recent cases that have intervened on this. The big one is going to be Teig versus Loeffler. You might have heard about this. It was a Court of Appeals decision from the end of the year, last year. And what they determined is that if you're holding interviews or discussing a hiring decision and you want to have a closed session, even if for that person, one of the candidates requests it, you still need to have enough information to say that there's a specific need. It's not enough for them to just assert that there's a need. There needs to be a specific need that would injure their reputation if it was discussed in the open, which means from IPIB's perspective, what we're recommending, and we didn't used to recommend this, what we're recommending is that most interviews and related discussions need to be held during open session. The number of circumstances within that Court of Appeals decision which could allow for closed session are pretty limited. So, there are examples. I think the example that we've been using to illustrate the Court of Appeals point is if you had you've brought somebody in, they seem like a good candidate, there's nothing on their resume that brings you cause for alarm, but you say, we're going to perform a background check, and they say, when I was 19 years old, I was found, it was underage possession of alcohol, I was out drinking with some friends, it was a really embarrassing thing. This was 2 decades ago, but it might come up on a background check, and I just want to make you aware of that. That sort of conversation, needless and irreparable injury, that would qualify. What the Court of Appeals requires is that a limited closed session be held to identify that, go back into open session, make the decision that you need to go into closed session for that purpose, go back into closed session, have that limited portion of the conversation, and then return to open session for the rest of the interview or the rest of the consideration. That's tedious, but it is what's required. The caveat to that is that that Court of Appeals decision has been accepted on appeal by the Supreme Court. So we might be giving different advice in 6 months, we might not be.
So you don't have a closed session because you're interviewing somebody, but you don't have a closed session on the agenda. How can you go back into a closed session and go into a closed session?
You would say that there's a possible closed session in advance. So you would need to say, because closed session needs to be announced on the agenda, in order to go into closed session, you would say, we're holding interviews, there's going to be possible closed sessions to discuss professional competency in the context of this hiring decision. That doesn't mean that you need to go into closed session, but it gives you that option if it's something that you. And we say the same thing, or we're giving that same advice right now. This is the advice that we used to give. So the advice that we used to give is that once those interviews are closed, it might be permissible to go into closed session to discuss pros and cons of hiring people, because there does seem to be reputational harm associated with saying, even if it's not negative, saying, out of these 3 candidates, I like this guy, and everybody says, I like this guy, we don't like this one. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong, but that is reputational harm. If there is that evaluation, we don't know whether that's still the law. IPIB, we don't get sued often, but we did get sued for that because that's how we held our last director interview, is we went into closed session for that purpose. We're urging people to be careful because we don't know what the outcome of that case is going to be. And in light of that Tide case, the other one that I mentioned, it seems like unless you have a really good reason to go into closed session, you should limit it just to that purpose and not go any further. Don't hold a general closed session for interviews. For other things, if we're talking about potentially terminating somebody, it's a lot easier to find that reputational harm. Perfect timing.
If our council is appointing somebody to a board or commission, and that person requests deliberation of the council in a closed session.
Only, what we're advising right now is only if there is a specific finding that reputational harm is at stake. That's the best advice that we have right now. Outstanding, thank you. Again, perfect timing. Brings us right to, let's make sure I covered everything. That's covered. Let's see, I got through closed sessions all that way. Here's, again, the list. Did I miss any? Oh, contested case. There it is. I don't think contested case licensing examinations, anybody? Cool.
I have another question though,
Yes.
closed sessions. So if you're doing a review of an employee and it's gonna be a good review, that has to be done in open session? Or no?
Probably.
It does, okay.
If there's anything negative in there, you can have, despite everything that I'm saying here, you can still have an extensive, a 1 hour long closed session if it's anything related to, your performance isn't up to snuff. We might be firing you for whatever reason. That's definitely reputational harm. There's no doubt about it.
Only if there's a meeting, right?
You elaborate.
Well, so you have to have the governmental meeting
Yes.
and a quorum of people there to.
So there is a loophole. The loophole is to delegate the decision-making process to somebody else. I was not interviewed in an open session because I was hired by the previous director. So they were delegated the authority to make that decision. I was not directly hired by the board. My interview was not an open session. When we hired our most recent director, both her interview and the discussion related to whether she was going to be hired, all of that was done in open session, including conversation about how much we were offering her, including criticism about, some of the things that she was lacking, right? And that's, don't take this as like a criticism here, but it's just normal conversation that comes up for anybody. The way that we're doing this and the way that we're advising other governmental bodies to do this until there's a Supreme Court decision that gives us, if there is different guidance, we're advising be real careful about that exception.
So when you say you weren't
Yes.
interviewed in open session, if you are not a direct report to the board, why would you have to have been in open session?
Well, I wasn't.
But you said something about the previous director, so now that's why you weren't, because you were hired by the previous director. Was that just if you were hired by this director, would you have to be in open session?
No.
Okay.
So if I was hired directly by the board, I would need to be interviewed for open session. Because I was hired by the previous director to serve under them, so there's 9-member board, director, staff attorney.
Okay.
And right now it's just me.
It's not an issue like,
It's not me. I think that was just a phone, but it just,
so as long as it's board and city manager can hire anyone underneath without an open. Okay.
If he has the authority to.
if they have the authority.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, this is the difference between direct hiring and not. Any decision that is delegated to somebody else that isn't a member of the governmental body, they can make those decisions for themselves. Superintendents are given a lot of power. I imagine city managers are given a lot of power for day-to-day activities of the government. And as long as they're exercising their power that's been delegated to them, they don't need to do that in open session because they're not a member of the governmental body.
Again, it all goes back to the question of whether or not the individual candidate requests a closed session too, is that correct?
Yes, they need to make a request. We had a case at one point where all of the other elements were definitely met, but the person didn't make the request and they later protested that they were forced to have their interview, or not interview, it was a termination in this case, but they were forced to have that in closed session. They later protested it. Technically speaking, they do need to make that request. I imagine the legislative purpose is, if an employee, same reason for students actually. If a student or their parent wants the suspension or expulsion meeting to remain open, that is their right to request that it remain open. Same goes for a employee who's potentially being terminated. They have that right.
Question, say you're doing promotional interviews for law enforcement, firefighters, and now, once the interviews are done, you are ranking them on, whatever order they're putting them on for promotions. Can you do that in closed sessions as far as talking about each individual person?
We don't know, that's why we're being sued. Look, here's my personal opinion, and as soon as the court tells me I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But the court hasn't told me I'm wrong yet. So what I would say is if you're making that sort of ranking, I think that does qualify as reputational harm. If you're, not for the person who's at the top, but they don't know that before they're ranked. If you have something like, you're making a scorecard for part of that deliberation, or if you're ranking people, it is my personal opinion, I can't really give this advice anymore because we're being sued. Can you tell I'm bitter? This case could be resolved the other way. This is just in light of that Tide case and in light of the fact that, the court does seem to be taking it seriously for the case that we're involved in. It is difficult for me to give advice one way or another. My personal leaning and the advice that I would have given you a year ago would have been, yeah, probably that is reputational harm, and as long as everybody who's going to be ranked requests it, you can do that in closed session. Now, exercise caution. I think it's still allowed, but I don't know that.
What did you do to get sued?
Well, I didn't do anything. This was before I.
What did I do?
This was the director who hired me. Her when she was hired back in 2023, so this case has been ongoing, the same, and I promise, I genuinely mean this, he's a good man. The same Tig from this case sued us, so there might be a Tig versus IPIP case. He's a good man, he cares deeply about government transparency. We have some disagreements about the interpretation of the law, but I know that his heart's in the right place, so I'm not defaming him here. He did sue us because we held that director, after the open session interviews, we held the portion where we decided which of the two was going to be hired in closed session. And my understanding, I wasn't there at the time, my understanding is that some negative comments in a normal way were made about both candidates just to weigh pros and cons. So does this person have enough experience? I don't know. That's kind of a negative comment. But again, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from and not giving firmer advice. I wish I could.
No, I do, but I mean, we're making the same comments, right?
Sure.
So,
So your suggestion is that if you've got 5 candidates for 2 positions or whatever the case would be, that you have all 5 asked to have a closed or have it closed, but then the question becomes, what happens if, let's say, 3 of the 5 or 2 of the 5 only request a closed session and the other 2 or 3 don't?
and can we make that suggestion to them?
Yeah, that's the point I was getting to, yes.
You can make the suggestion if some request it and some don't. We're getting really in the weeds. I would need to think about it more.
Okay.
It all comes back to this case is a little bit different from past case law. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means we're still trying to figure out, because this was decided so recently in the scheme of the law, we're still trying to figure out the details of what best to advise. And the advice that we are giving during this period is, unless you have a really good justification, interview, closed session should be kept to a minimum. And if they are used, they should be used for specific conversation rather than the whole interview or the whole discussion afterwards.
How about selecting people to be interviewed?
It's gonna be the same answer. So
Think, I mean, someone applies for, I'm just saying city manager because we just hired one, but 50 people applied for it, and how do you pick the 3 people that get to be interviewed?
So when we did that for our board, we recently had our executive director, one moved on. We had 3 candidates apply. One of them, all respect to him, was clearly not qualified for the position. He hadn't graduated law school yet, which is really a great ambition. Hard to lead a agency when you haven't passed the bar yet, but ambition, nothing but respect for that. But we did discuss that in open session. We said this person isn't qualified, we're going to take them out. We discussed the other 2 applications and said both of these are potentially good candidates. We're going to invite both of them for interviews. If you have 50 candidates, I imagine there'd be a lot more reading that needed to be done. One thing that I will say, and we'll get to this in chapter 22, is that the applications themselves, generally speaking, are confidential. And so you could at least review those in confidence, even if the remaining discussion about who to hire would be held in open session. If there was a specific negative comment that came up based on the resume, the advice that we've been giving for resumes, because we have had this question before, is people rarely put the reputationally damaging thing on their resume. I wouldn't do it. You don't disclose that on your resume, you disclose that at the interview. So the number of times that there's actually going to be that reputationally damaging thing, aside from the observations that you make if you say this, this resume is disorganized, does that rise to the level of needless and irreparable reputational harm? Maybe, probably not. If you say that somebody is not qualified, does that rise to the level? Maybe. And so again, we're just telling people to be careful. There may be an opportunity both to review the confidential record in closed session and to discuss certain parts of it if that finding is made. I guess just because I want to make sure that everybody gets home at a reasonable hour, if you have more specific questions for me, I think just because it's so complicated, it would be easier if I was able to review them in writing. My email is going to be at the end of this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm not trying to avoid it. I just want to make sure everyone gets home on But I do appreciate those questions. It's definitely on our minds too. For 21, nothing actually in chapter 21 requires a governmental body to hold a closed session. Other sections of the code, including federal law, may have that, but nothing in 21 requires it. No additional topics can be discussed. It needs to be only the topic of discussion. There's a district court case that we always highlight. Eventually we'll take their name out of there and they can stop being our example, but there was a case involving the DeWitt School Board where they went into closed session for a proper purpose and then they basically had their meeting. The district court was not happy about that. They still recorded it and then they turned it over, so, I guess good faith, but the session does need to be recorded, speaking of. It needs to be recorded with at least audio, not necessarily video. And there need to be detailed minutes taken. Detailed minutes, this is unlike the minutes from before, which don't necessarily need to capture all of the deliberation. Detailed minutes is not quite a transcript, but it does mean that every conversation, all of the different points that are raised in closed session need to be recorded. And the reason why both are requested is for redundancy. Members cannot be excluded from a closed session unless it's related to a conflict related to the specific purpose for closed session. And then they are able to access the closed session minutes, even though those are otherwise conflicts. And then final action, as I said at the beginning, must happen in open session. There is an exempt category. This doesn't come up really at all, and I'm kind of amazed at this. I don't think I've ever fielded a real life scenario related to Chapter 20, but Chapter 20 covers strategy and matters related to employment conditions of employees of the governmental body who are not covered by a collective bargaining agreement. There is, in other words, a very specific set of requirements for collective bargaining in Chapter 20. And all this means this isn't a closed session allowance. This just means that Chapter 20 governs those meetings as opposed to Chapter 21. Essentially, they had a different set of rules separate from 21, and they kept those rules separate for that topic. This is the shorter part of our presentation, don't worry. Public records.
Can I back you
Yes.
up one question?
Yes.
And I apologize here.
Oh, no worries. I'm here all night.
So talk about, for a little bit if you would, being what can or cannot be discussed after a closed session from those folks that participated in the closed session.
Sure. Chapter 21 doesn't have any specific requirements for that. What we say is if your governmental body made the decision to go into closed session, generally speaking, the matters discussed should remain confidential. But Chapter 21 doesn't have any penalties for breaking confidentiality. The only confidentiality rule for after the closed session is that the detailed minutes and the recording are considered confidential records, which should not be made available to the public. But aside from that, at the very least, it would not be a violation of Chapter 21. If you held a meeting to terminate an employee, had a 50-minute conversation, and then after the meeting, one of the council members went out and had a conversation with somebody else and said, here's what we discussed. And, maybe that's morally not the right thing to do. Maybe it's not the right thing to do from the perspective of, your relationship to others in the governmental body. But Chapter 21 doesn't have anything to say about it. For public records. Public records, we're going to be talking about what is a public record, who can obtain public records, what the governmental body needs to do to comply with legal requirements for producing the records, and then what exemptions exist, because there's 76 of them. I'm not going to be going into all of them, but they are there. And then penalties at the end is just one slide. What is a public record? A public record is documents, tape, or other information stored in any medium of or belonging to the government body. Now, government body is a different word than governmental body, which is the word I've been using for Chapter 21. Governmental body is that voting board, the board, council, commission, governing body, city councils, all of those. Government body includes everybody who works for the government, although it doesn't include those gambling nonprofits. They're actually not subject to public records law, they're only subject to open meetings. Pretty much anybody else, including all of those staff members, so your employees, for library boards, they're librarians, for a city council. If the mayor isn't a member of the governmental body, and I'm not sure what the structure is for Indianola. But, but if they aren't, then they are still covered by this. They can create public records, the clerk can create public records, the city supervisor, city manager can create public records. Anybody, code enforcer, all the way down, can create public records. Public records include emails, websites, texts, some social media, not all social media. We have advice on that on our website. But it is the content of the record, rather than where it is located, that determines whether something is or is not a public record. So here's the one part of the presentation that has props. It's real exciting. Stand back. Here's my personal cell phone. Here's my government-issued cell phone. I do all of my government business on this. If I'm taking a call, if I'm giving advice, if I'm sending an email, I have this. I have my government-issued laptop right there. And when I leave my employment someday, this is going back to the state. This is my personal cell phone is turned off. This is where I call my family, take pictures of my cat, right? It's good to keep them separate. That's work-life balance. Now, if you don't have this, and I recognize that this isn't feasible for everybody, the second best practice is to have a separate device. Here's your government email account, and here's your personal email account. My government email account is where I send all of my government emails, even if it's on the same device. Government account, private account. If I have something like Google Docs to store those documents, not on my personal device, but on the cloud where it's accessible to everybody, I avoid the situation where somebody's going to be going through my phone to get public records. That's a lovely thing, because no skeletons in the closet. I still don't want people digging through my personal cell phone. This concludes the prop portion of the presentation. But as I said, it is the content of the record rather than where it's located that determines whether something is a public record. And we had a case, I don't remember which one of these it is, they're too close in number, but one of those, I think it's 24AO0008, where a police officer was using his government-issued cell phone and his government-issued email account, the same one that he did all of his police work on, to have very personal conversations. That's not an innuendo. He was talking about child custody, he was talking about a divorce, he was scheduling meetings with his therapist, and he was doing all of this on his government account. And I wouldn't recommend that. But what we found in that case is even though he shouldn't have been commingling those things, those were still not records of the governmental body, meaning that they still were not subject to Chapter 22 because they were related to his personal life. I put my personal cell phone away, but if I was using my personal cell phone to handle a case related to my work as an attorney, then that, even though it's on my personal device, would be a public record. So there's your distinction.
But they couldn't get your cat pictures, right?
Cat pictures are probably not of or belonging to the government body, hopefully, unless it's the agency cat. See, that would make me happy.
Push for that.
We had that whole work from home period, and then if there was an agency office cat, I don't need work from home anymore. Still would. So best practices, we recommend have one level of separation at least. So if it's devices, if you can, that's the best. If it's accounts, that still works. I think of it kind of like putting a glove on so you can do your government business. Maybe that's a little, not quite the right metaphor, but putting a glove on, and then I take the glove off, I go home, and I do whatever I'm doing in my personal life. With that in mind, the lawful custodian, whoever's responsible for Chapter 22, needs to have access to anything that could have a public record on it. So there needs to be some sort of policy in place for that access. The best way to avoid whoever that is going through your device is just to never wear the glove when you need to wear the glove, don't when you don't. Who can obtain public records? Anybody can. And Chapter 22 speaks generally. Every member of the public has the same rights under Chapter 22, regardless of their relationship to the records. Other parts of the law, like FERPA, like, criminal civil discovery, a court can order disclosure based on, the need for a record in a case. But as far as Chapter 22 is concerned, it doesn't matter if it's a student record about your child, it doesn't matter if it's your former personnel file, and you're fired from your job and you want more information about how that decision was made. All of those still confidential. If they're confidential for one person, they're confidential for everyone under Chapter 22. Again, anybody can examine, photograph, or copy a public record. Once it's made available to somebody, it should be made available to everybody. This is what we mean by waiver. So if it is made available under Chapter 22, then the privilege is waived for everybody. I should add as a caveat, before we get too much into 22, Chapter 22 only deals with public records. It doesn't deal with retention. It doesn't deal with the creation of records, with one exception. I'll get to it. But it doesn't deal with the creation of records. It doesn't require the government to provide information or conduct research. It only requires access to records. So if a record doesn't exist, or if it doesn't exist in the form that somebody wants, let's say you have monthly budgets but not a yearly spreadsheet, nobody can make a request that says, hey, give me the yearly spreadsheet, or just give me a table that includes these items but not the others, or do this research for me. We had an auditor reach out with panic in her voice saying, I just got a request for every piece of land in the county that has coal rights delegated to somebody else. And that would require them to go back to like 1875 and go through each of these records one by one to see if it's there. That's a request for research or information, not for public records. So there's your distinction. Just wanted to get that out of the way because I think it answers a lot of the other questions that come up. Identifiable individual. So anonymity is allowed. You can make a request. You don't have to show your ID. You don't have to give your real name, your face. We don't see this all that often, but if somebody has an email and it's just, Des Moines Citizen 0013, and they're asking for records, they should be treated the same as anybody else. They can't be required to show their ID or explain the reason why they're seeking the record. They just have the same rights to access. They just need to provide enough information to receive the information that they're seeking, whether that's an email to send the electronic records to, or a date that they can come in and pick up a physical record. How about compliance? So every government body should designate a person or contact who can be responsible for Chapter 22. Now that doesn't need to be a specific person, it can be. What it does need to be is, here's the email that you reach out to, here's the mailing address where we can receive records requests, here's the form that you fill out. There does need to be all four options. There needs to be the option for in-person requests during reasonable business hours, telephone requests, email, or some form of electronic request, or written request. As long as those four options are open, the government body has complied with its duties. And again, lawful custodian is the government body currently in physical possession of the record, with some caveats which we'll get to. Lawful custodian does not mean the automated data processing unit. So there are agencies that store records for other agencies or private companies that do that. Those are not the lawful custodian. The lawful custodian is the body that the record itself belongs to in those cases. The government body is not actually subject to any specific time requirements for the most part. This is a common misconception, probably the biggest misconception when it comes to the laws that we administer. You might have heard it if you ever deal with records requests, or if you deal with those a lot. This 10 to 20 business day thing that people will quote, this is a misconception. There is no such rule. Technically speaking, 22.84D provides that 10 to 20 days specifically for the purposes of determining whether a confidential record is going to be made available to a person requesting it. Everything else, from the collection of those records, to seeking an injunction in court, to consulting with legal counsel, to assembling them, running the copier, making the email, all of those are not subject to a specific time requirement. Instead, we look for what's reasonable. And there's two factors for that. We look first to the nature of the request. So if this is a request for one specific record, it's clearly not confidential, that should generally take a couple days at most. If it's a request for 500 documents and they come from 6 different computers and there's a lot of confidentiality issues, that can take weeks, if not months, in some cases. Generally speaking, weeks. But we look for what's reasonable rather than a specific time requirement. Good faith delay is allowed. The other side of that good faith delay, we also look at communication factors. The Supreme Court has identified 6 factors in a case called Bellin v. Reynolds in 2023. These talk about whether the government body has constructively denied a request. Constructive denial means that even though they haven't said we're not giving you these records, by delaying for a long period and not giving you updates, we have constructively said we're not giving you these records. And this considers things like whether the government body has communicated that they've received the request in the first place, whether they're providing updates, whether they provide updates related to delays, if delays come up, and then whether there's rolling production of the record. So if it's a very long request, you're talking hundreds of documents, then you can say, well, here's the ones that we have at the end of this week, here's the first portion, and we're still working on the remainder. Right? As for fees, reasonable fees may be charged based on actual direct costs incurred by the government body. That includes hourly rates, that includes printing costs, if there's printing used. We usually look at 5 to 15 cents per page is a reasonable number. 50 cents is the sort of number that a commercial business would charge, and they're charging revenue. So actual direct costs is the standard. Everything else that isn't a direct cost, so this includes the fees associated, or the costs associated with producing the record in the first place, that can't be offloaded to the requester. It also can't include things like electricity for the building, that's not direct. It can't include insurance or other retirement benefits that somebody might have, and it can't include the depreciation of the printer as part of that printing costs. It also can't exceed the actual cost to the governmental body, whatever that cost may be. One of the things that does come up as a wrinkle in this is if the governmental body does not have the ability to provide a service itself. So if they don't have printing equipment, then you can charge the cost that you actually had to pay for a commercial printer, right? So you go to Staples, you print out the 30 pages, you charge the cost that Staples gave you. This came up in the context, has anybody heard of Keoma Village? Keoma Village is the smallest incorporated city in Iowa by geographic size. They are, it's like 3 streets, they're not even contiguous, they're right on the side of a park. It just happens to be one city, there's about 60 people there, there's no stoplights. Lovely little town, I've heard, but they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have a printer. They, their city attorney is the attorney from, I believe, Osceola, so a lot of what they do comes from somewhere else. They actually don't even meet in their city, they meet in Osceola. So they didn't have a printer available, they didn't have an office to print things in. What they did is they relied on a commercial printer, and they were allowed to charge those costs. Although ideally, they probably should have used the Osceola printer, I'm sure they had one, but what can you do?
What about salaries?
So yes, so the hourly rate is included, that is actual direct cost. So if you have somebody, your records custodian's paid $30 an hour, and they spend 2 hours working on it, as long as it's reasonable that they spend 2 hours, you can charge $60. And we've had, this is where the very expensive requests come from. We had one, bless his heart, a gentleman requested like 30,000 emails. He didn't end up going through with this, thank goodness, but he requested 30,000 emails. The government body, I think, reasonably said that this is going to take about 120 hours to review, and then we're going to need to run it by our attorney. It was something like $25 an hour for the person who was going to be reviewing it. And what we said is the $4,000 charge that he was quoted was reasonable because of the scope of that records request. So there is no upper bound, although, you know, you can be unreasonable if it's not actually based on reasonable actual costs. Also, don't request 30,000 records. That just kind of be a little more specific, you know. For routine requests, this is the exception. For routine requests taking less than 30 minutes, generally speaking, those should be provided for free. So if somebody requests your meeting minutes, you don't say, well, that's going to take me 5 minutes to produce, so 60 minutes divided by 5, let's go with, you pay me $5. Send that in, and then I'll give you the meeting minutes. Just give it to them. When we say every reasonable effort to provide the records, there's no cost other than actual copying cost for those routine requests. Every reasonable effort, the way that we interpret that is if somebody makes serial records requests, so they're requesting one thing today, another thing tomorrow, another thing the next day, and it adds up, that's when you can start charging them. And then government bodies can control the terms and conditions of access to records on their electronic databases. There's no requirement that permits somebody to come in, open your computer, and dig through your files. Attorney costs. So legal fees can be charged, but only for the actual direct costs associated with redaction or confidentiality review. So your attorney should not be the one going through the emails, putting in the keywords, and downloading everything as a PDF to put in a file. That's something somebody else should be doing. And you certainly wouldn't be able to charge their legal fees if they were doing that. Because legal fees, lawyers are expensive. Again, it should only be the redaction confidentiality review. This means that it also doesn't include the time that the lawyer spends researching the law, if they need to refresh their knowledge of something. It also doesn't include the time that's spent consulting with a lawyer. It's only the time that the lawyer spends redacting. With that said, fees charged by county attorneys, we have a recent advisory opinion saying that if the records custodian themselves is the attorney, so IPIB, we only have 2 staff attorneys. If a request was made to us, we could charge our hourly rates, which aren't that high because we're government employees. So. But we could still charge our rates. And then redaction. Before we get to confidentiality, if you have a mix of records, and some are confidential, or some parts of a record are confidential, but some aren't, then only the confidential portion should be redacted. The remainder should be turned over. So from a real case, there's a case involving an incident involving, I think it was a girls' soccer team. And the portion related to the students, so there were emails going back and forth between the administrators. Part of it talked about a student and the discipline that they were facing based on this incident. And that portion, absolutely confidential because it's student information and student record belonging to a school. That portion could be blacked out, and the remainder talking about what the school was doing to resolve this, that was not confidential and needed to be turned over with those redactions. Last portion of the presentation, then I'll let you all get out of here. Confidential records. So there are currently 76 different categories of confidentiality. The legislature just added 2 new ones, which I doubt will ever come up, but they are there. Most of these actually have never come up. We're not aware of any cases where they're actually used. Maybe that's because some of them are obvious. So there's one that says if the government body has somebody's social security number that's confidential, I think everybody just kind of expects that. But there are others that are just super specific. With that in mind, I'm going to be covering a few of the most common ones, just so that they're on your radar. The caveat to this is that some of these have their own rules. This is just an overview of types. So if you see something medical records on the list, that doesn't necessarily mean that anything that could be called medical record is exempt. Make sure you're reading the law if you're applying confidentiality. With that said, personal student information and student records belonging to a school. Medical records, trade secrets protected by law. We have a recent advisory opinion talking about this, and you might think trade secrets doesn't apply to me. The context where this comes up most often is RFPs. So if you have a you're taking in bids from companies and saying, you know, we have this project, we want you to do maintenance on the street, we want you to propose, solar panels for our roofs, something like that. And you're accepting bids. Oftentimes those bids will have proprietary information that the companies are sharing with you that they don't want to get out there. And we have a great advisory opinion that's interpreting Chapter 550 in the context of this exception, talking about what the government body should be doing to make sure that that can remain confidential and how they should assess assertions of confidentiality in those bids. Attorney work product related to litigation or claims made by or against a public body. This also includes attorney-client privilege communications are considered confidential. Appraisal information for the sale or purchase of property before that sale is made or abandoned. Criminal identification files of law enforcement agencies, so this includes most types of inmate records, which are also governed by Chapter 904. Probably not too much for folks in this room, but we do bring it up. Library records, which could be used to identify a patron based on the books that they're checking out or the services that they're requesting. Examinations, including law enforcement examinations, if turning those over would interfere with the purpose of those examinations, so things like answer sheets. Medical examiner reports, including their investigative reports, security information related to the protection of life or property, if disclosure would jeopardize those, intelligence data used to anticipate, prevent, or monitor possible criminal activity. This includes traffic cameras. So, again, doesn't sound applicable, definitely is for a lot of cities. And then information in a record which would permit a government body to hold a closed session until final action is taken on that matter. So this is sort of a catch-all, there's a catch-all both ways. But this one has a ton of caveats, so be aware of that. Some of those exceptions may have special rules. There are also other areas of the code that have their own rules. I'm just going to be covering, I think, four specific exceptions that come up more often than any of the others. Probably the biggest is confidential personnel records. Every government body has employees. Most of them do, I assume. I probably shouldn't make those big assertions, but personal information and confidential personnel records of government bodies relating to identified or identifiable persons. So this is individual personal data. If you have general employee policies, those aren't confidential. If you have a general employee insurance plan, that isn't confidential. But if it's related to that person, things like their home address, their personal contact information, the reasons given for sick leave, their insurance information, social security number. This also includes birthdays. There's a gentleman from California who requests birthdays from every government body in Iowa. He's making his way down the list. That sounds crazy. The reason he's doing this is because he's concerned about age discrimination in government hiring practices, but he requests birthdays. So the birthday guy, you don't actually have to turn over birthdays if he comes to you. Fun fact. Because that's considered confidential personnel information. There are 5 exceptions to that general rule, and those 5 exceptions are: the employee's name is not confidential, their compensation, so not the reasons for sick leave, but the fact that they have 12 days of sick leave per year, whatever it may be, pay, benefits, severance, retirement, written agreements about terms of employment, those are not confidential. The employment dates and positions held with the government body. The educational background and their previous employment are not confidential if those are in government records. And whether the individual resigned in lieu of termination, was discharged, or demoted as the result of a disciplinary action, and the reasons and rationale for that decision. So if somebody's fired for disciplinary reasons, as opposed to, the budget got cut. If somebody's fired for those reasons or forced to resign for those reasons, that is not confidential. That doesn't mean that everything in their personnel file is not confidential, but at least enough information to explain why that decision was made is not confidential. And the reason why is because the legislature wants to make sure that when these decisions are being made, they're not being made in the dark. The other big one that applies to most governmental bodies is communications from persons outside of government. So this is persons outside of government, so they don't have a position with the government, including a volunteer position or a contract for compensation. Their communications are not required by law or any rule. Their communications are made where the lawful custodian could reasonably determine that the person would be dissuaded from reporting if the communication was made public. And then this individual, whoever it is communicating, they need to be identified, and they also can't have given permission. So if somebody says, here's my communication from a person outside of government, also feel free to share this with anybody, you can't assert this rule because they waived that for themselves. There's also some specific, the big one is if information involved in the communication, if it indicates the date, time, specific location, or immediate facts and circumstances of a crime or other illegal act, is not covered by this, although it may be covered by other exceptions. So that sounds a little esoteric. Where the big area where this qualifies is applications. A few others that qualify are victim statements to police. If somebody wants to bring something to your attention, this is sort of a catch-all for, hey, I want this to be brought up at a city council meeting because I have a dispute with my neighbors, but I don't want it to be public, what my name is. That could be confidential. For job applications, the court has interpreted it's a case called Press Club, that job applications are generally covered with this as long as the person making the communication says or doesn't say that they want it to be released to the public, which generally speaking they won't. With that said, there's two exceptions. In 2024, the Supreme Court held that this doesn't apply to internal candidates who already have an arrangement with the government body. So if you are in one role and applying to another role within the same government, you are not covered by this and your application is non-confidential, public record. It also doesn't apply to applications to fill an elected office. So if there's a vacancy that could be filled with a special election and the government body chooses to hold make an appointment instead, what the Supreme Court held in Dirks v. Scott County in 2025 is that these also are not protected by 22-718. Draft records is the third that qualifies for just about every government body, and this is the reason we include it. Custodians can withhold tentative, preliminary, draft, speculative, or research material before it's used for its final purpose. So if you have rough draft 1 through 5 and then the one that gets presented to the government, 1 through 5 are protected. On the other hand, once you bring it to the government body, or the final decision maker, once it's presented, once it's used in a way where it's no longer a draft, even if they say go back to the drawing board after you present it, then it is no longer a draft record. We have another lovely little flow chart talking about whether it's been submitted to a public official, whether it's been used in the actual formulation of policies, whether it outlines an idea, beginning of investigations, that's talking about the research qualification, whether it's been used in official government policy making, whether there's been deliberation by a governmental body using this record, and then does withholding the document encourage the creation and free exchange by government employees and officials of new, innovative, preliminary, tentative ideas? That's pretty lofty, but that's sort of the standard that we're trying to differentiate. Last but not least, I'm not going to cover this too much because I don't think anybody here deals with police investigative files all that much. This is the most complicated of all of the exceptions. It's extensively litigated. We have so many advisory opinions about it. The law changes all the time. It is a qualified privilege. Law enforcement records are qualified. There's a balancing test that applies for the release of those records. Essentially what it's looking for is if there's a scandal, if there's a public matter, or if it's not a record, or if the record itself is not something made in official confidence. All of those are reasons why it might not be privileged. But I'm not going to get into too much detail. I'm happy to answer questions about it if you come to me later. But there's, it's here for you. If it ever comes up, I doubt it'll come up for anyone in this room. Tell me if I'm wrong. Last but not least, I said at the beginning that Chapter 22 never requires you to create records. This is the one exception. Settlement records, if the government body is involved in a legal dispute, when that matter is settled, the government body must create a document, if requested, must create a document that indicates the identity of the parties involved, the nature of the dispute, and the terms of the settlement. Even if there's not a document existing, if a request is made for that, it needs to be created. It doesn't need to be long, but the legislature has said that for these sort of settlement resolutions needs to be disclosed. Records can be released if they're ordered to be released by the court, if they're released by the lawful custodian of the records, or if they're released by somebody else who's duly authorized to release them, and that turns them into non-confidential records, even if they're otherwise entitled to confidentiality. And then finally, this is our last slide, penalties and sanctions. The law does provide for civil lawsuits. We saved this to the end because it's not fun to talk about. Either courts or IPIB can hear these complaints, institute proceedings. We can hold investigations. This is IPIB's authority to do so. Generally speaking, what we try to do and what happened in the case that actually led to this meeting, we love informal resolution. The best thing that we can do if a government body misses something on the law is find an informal resolution that allows us to come hold a training like this. We get that most government bodies, there are a few exceptions, but most government bodies that we work with, even if it seems like an egregious violation, people are working in good faith. They're willing to adopt better practices. IPIB is super generous about this, the courts aren't, but that's why IPIB, we really like it when people bring complaints to us because that allows us to have that informal, relatively efficient, relatively cost-free, relatively everybody's happy at the end sort of resolutions. With that in mind, penalties have been raised for Chapter 21 violations. Courts will find this, they will award those penalties. It used to be for both Chapter 21 and 22, the minimum amount was $100 per person who was violating. It's been raised to $500 minimum for Chapter 21 violations, but not for Chapter 22. And the maximum for intentional violations is now $12,500, which is more than I have to just give away.
And is that per person?
Per person. So the I don't know if it's good news, but the caveat to that is that if these damages are assessed, those damages are paid to the government body. It goes into the budget as opposed to going to the person who sued. Attorney's fees, if there are attorney's fees, court costs, those are awarded to the person who sued. And then in terms of defenses, ignorance of the law is not a defense. If you don't know the law and you violate it, But if you vote against a violation, if you refuse to participate in a violation, if you engage in efforts to resist the violation, or if you rely on a formal opinion of the Attorney General, of IPIB, or your attorney, which is either in writing or memorialized at a meeting, then you can rely on that as a defense for the individuals. And this is what we see in a lot of the cases. They rely on IPIB or they rely on their own attorney's legal advice more often. I've covered most of these. These are included at the end of the thing, just so if you want to review these later, they're available as advice. But I'm not going to go into too much detail on these. There is a training requirement. Congratulations to everybody who is subject to that. You've just done it. That must be completed within 90 days of the time you take your oath of office, assume the responsibilities of the position, or when you're elected. We have more guidance available for this on our website if there's anybody who wasn't able to make this training. But for everybody here, this slide doesn't really apply to you. And then we have our contact information. I think the best thing for reaching out to us, even though we're a small agency, we are able to give advice, including legal advice that you're allowed to rely on to avoid at least damages being assessed against you. Doesn't mean that we're right. Usually we are, sometimes we aren't. The courts certainly can overrule us, but generally speaking, we're here to be a resource. It's better to reach out to us, get advice from us, let us share the law with you, as opposed to just going forward and taking the complaint when it comes.
Are there charges associated with
No,
that?
no. There are no charges associated with IPIB. Unless you're requesting records from us, we do follow a record fee, but there's no charges. Taxpayer dollars pay for us to be available. So
Alex, we just had a couple of members, one appointed to the board of, library board, and then one to the IMU board, and so they do qualify under this training, obviously. And so that slide said within 90 days of their appointment to a board or commission, is that correct? So we probably need to, when we start moving people into those positions as other folks move off, we need to make sure that, I know Jackie and Monica and everybody's on top of that, but,
So, just for those folks, if you have somebody who needs the training, we have our online trainings. I actually had one earlier today, so this is the second time that I've given this presentation today. But we also have alternative providers, so we have, I think we're gonna have 3 different law firms soon that often work with government bodies, so Allers Cooney, Lynch, Dallas, and Hopkins and Huebner. ISU has their own training program. The Iowa League of Cities has their own training program. The Iowa School Board Association has one. And Lynn County, for whatever reason, has their own.
so all those are acceptable to IPIB then?
Yes, any of them that are listed on our website as approved providers are approved, and you can meet the requirements. The downside to those is that many of them do charge fees. IPIB is the only one who's required to offer these without a fee. I don't know if all of them do, but I know that some of them do. Generally speaking, those fees, there's group fees, so it's not too much and it can be taken out of the government body's budget, but there are fees associated with some of the others. Are there any other questions? All right.
One, yes.
Yes.
Is this something that we can get from you so that if somebody would want to go back through that for whatever reason? Is that possible?
Yes. I will send it to Jackie. Perfect. Tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm gonna go home and sleep, but I'll send it to Jackie tomorrow.
Thank you, folks. I appreciate y'all being here. Make sure you sign in before you leave.